Good afternoon. This is Katasha Cornwell with the FDOT Office of Environmental Management. Thank you all for joining our 2020 PD&E and ETDM Manual Revision webinar. It's kind of like our little release party. Our webinar today will be recorded and posted on our website for future access. OEM has been working closely with our subject matter experts, district counterparts, administrators, our director, and the Office of General Counsel to update the 2019 PD&E Manual. OEM appreciates the efforts from all of those that have reviewed and provided comments throughout this process. Along with the PD&E manual update, the ETDM manual has undergone some minor pen and ink changes that we'll also be discussing today. These two updated manuals, along with the associated changes in the statewide environmental project tracker, known as SWEPT, will all be released on July 1st. The manual should be used for tasks and ongoing projects or new projects that will begin after the publication date. If there are questions about the applicability of changes in the manuals for efforts that are currently underway, consultants should coordinate with their FDOT project manager. District staff should contact their project delivery coordinator at OEM. And now I'll turn the webinar over to Christine Haddock, our PD&E manual publisher extraordinaire, to walk you through the most important updates for this PD&E manual release.
Thanks, Katasha. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on the PD&E and ETDM manual updates. First, let's start with some housekeeping tips. This webinar will be interactive and we encourage your participation in a series of poll questions. And as Katasha mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. We're going to have it available on OEM's website. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat box to ask them. We'll have staff monitoring the chat as we go along, and if not answered in the chat, then we will address them at the end of our presentation during a question and answer session. Okay, let's begin with a poll question so that we have an idea of our audience today. On your screen, you'll see a question appear, and please let us know which describes you best. There we go. Please answer which one you think works for you guys. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, it looks like we have more consultants in the audience. Okay, thank you for participating. Okay, let's begin first with part one of the PD&E manual. Now, there were formatting changes and minor changes made to all the chapters during this revision. These include deleting the form numbers for all of the forms that are located in either SWEPT or in the EST. And for some chapters, this meant that the actual form section itself was deleted. These forms are going to be removed from the forms management system around the same time that the updated manual is published. The water quality and stormwater issue was changed to water resources, and this required changing the title of Part 2, Chapter 11. The information from the Aquatic Preserves and Outstanding Florida Waters chapter was also moved to this chapter so that all of those references have been updated as well. The Class of Action Determination for Highway Projects chapter was also renamed, and it is now Class of Action Determination for Federal Projects. So those references were updated accordingly. And references were added to the two new chapters, the U.S. Coast Guard Project and Navigation chapter, and the Acquisition and Restoration Council, or ARC Coordination chapter. Hyperlinks were updated, and the history section was updated for each chapter as well. First, let's go over changes to Part 1. The first chapter is, introduction. There were only minor changes to this chapter. The next chapter 2, Class of Action Determination for Federal Projects. As I just mentioned, the title was renamed. And information on early acquisition Type 1 CE projects was clarified, showing that a Type 1 CE checklist is completed for these projects and that they require coordination with multiple agencies, stakeholders, and OEM. The MICE process was updated, also with emphasis on coordination rather than findings, and an explanation of how the process is built into the Type 1 CE checklist was added. And the chapter now lists these items on the checklist that when they're selected, they require coordination with OEM to determine if the project can proceed as a Type 1 CE. The MICE determination key was also removed from the chapter, and edits were made to clarify what a federal project is, as well as to add guidance that if an environmental impact statement is anticipated, the district should coordinate early on with OEM. And clarification was also added on changing the class of action. There were changes that affected the Type 1 CE checklist. A new subsection under right-of-way was added to address those state conservation lands that are subject to review and approval by the Acquisition and Restoration Council, or ARC. So Wild and Scenic Rivers question was also modified to add the state-listed Myakka River, and the nationwide rivers, inventory rivers, were moved to their own sub-question. And the environmental class of action recommendation form was also updated with those new issue titles, recreation areas, and protected lands and water resources. Now on to Chapter 3, Preliminary Environmental Discussion and Advanced Notification. The preliminary environmental discussion itself was restructured, and this chapter was modified to reflect those changes. So some of the issue titles were updated, and the nationwide rivers inventory was added as its own issue. Guidance was also added to identify any ARC lands. Updates were made to correct the names of organizations that the AN is sent to, as well as address corrections to the contact information. Chapter 4, Project Development Process. Edits to this chapter include the addition of a new section and subsections providing guidance on environmental review for early acquisition projects. And a link was added to the new Alternatives Corridor Evaluation Report template, and clarifications were made to the Interchange Access Request Review and Approval process. And this included deleting the Preliminary Designs Activities table, which was there as Table 4-2, and also Figure 4-5 was edited mainly to remove references to this table that was deleted. Chapter 5, Type 2 Categorical Exclusion. In the overview, clarification was added that if a public hearing is required, a draft Type 2 CE is made available for public inspection at the public hearing. There were also edits to the guidance on preparing the Type 2 CE form, such as moving that brief description of the location, length, and termini to the project description section, rather than it being in the purpose and needs section. And the guidance on the Wild and Scenic Rivers resource was updated. To the public involvement section, it was added that in cases where a community awareness plan was prepared, you should include a document explaining why it was prepared instead of a public involvement plan. And other changes were made to match the form in SWEPT and to provide clarification on the differences between those items that are technical materials and those things that should be included as attachments to the Type 2 CE. The document review process section was updated, and the document review process flowchart was removed as a figure, and it was replaced with a link to this diagram, which is on OEM's website. And it's more up to date and detailed than what was previously provided in the chapter. In Chapter 6, Environmental Assessment, guidance on entering the project schedules into the permitting dashboard and updating it was added to the overview. And this same language was also added to the FONSI, the draft EIS, and the final EIS chapters. And USDOT released an interim policy on page limits for NEPA documents and focused analysis. So information from this policy was added to the chapter to add clarification on keeping the document concise. And it states that the EA should generally be no more than 75 pages. This limit does not include, though, the appendices or the materials that are incorporated by reference. And if more pages are needed, then the district needs to coordinate and receive authorization from OEM. And as with the Type 2 CE chapter, that document review process was updated, the flowchart removed, and it was replaced with a link to this diagram, which is also on OEM's website. Now on to Chapter 7, Finding of No Significant Impact. Like with the previous chapter, guidance was added on entering project schedules into that permitting dashboard, and the document review process was updated, and the flowchart was removed as done in those other chapters. There were changes in this chapter to the limitations of claims language, and this is clarifying that OEM provides the limitations of claims notice and cover letter to Federal Highway for their signature, and then OEM submits it to the Federal Register. The sample limitations of claims cover letter was removed as a figure, and instead a link was provided to this new OEM guidance for processing limitations of claims, which includes a sample cover letter. Moving on to Chapter 8, Draft Environmental Impact Statement. Executive Order 13807 included the goal of completing federal environmental reviews and authorization decisions within 2 years of publication of the Notice of Intent. And this was added to the overview along with an explanation of this one federal decision process and the types of projects that it's going to apply to. So USDOT established an interim policy on the application of the one federal decision process, and an MOU was established that includes the exceptions and agency responsibilities. And FDOT's responsibilities, they're incorporated into the ETDM and PD&E processes. And this also included the addition of 3 cooperating agency concurrent points and authorization decision deadlines. Guidance on entering the project schedules into the permitting dashboard was added like in the EA chapter. Only a period of no later than 30 days after publication of the Notice of Intent was added for those major infrastructure projects, and those are those that follow the one federal decision process. And items from the executive order were added to the list of activities that are carried out in consultation with cooperating and participating agencies before the Notice of Intent is issued. The process for submittal of the Notice of Intent to the Federal Register was updated, and OEM now provides it to Federal Highway for signature, and then OEM submits it to the Federal Register. And there were also minor edits to the cover letter in Figure 8-3. This chapter was also updated to include guidance from the interim policy on page limits. And according to this policy, the draft EIS should generally be no more than 150 pages, which does not include the executive summary, the appendices, or any of the materials that are incorporated by reference. And if the project may exceed this number, the district then coordinates and receives authorization from OEM. And projects that qualify for that one federal decision policy, they may most likely will need to exceed these limits. This interim policy also required changes to the executive summary, limiting it to 15 pages. And further guidance from the policy on preparing the summary was added as well. Edits to the document review process, including the changes we mentioned in several of the previous chapters, as well as noting that if the project is a major infrastructure project, concurrence of the preferred alternative is obtained during the cooperating agency review. There were also additional edits updating the guidance on submitting the notice of availability in the Federal Register, and OEM submits the information to EPA through ENEPA. For Chapter 9, Final Environmental Impact Statements, information on the executive order and the permitting dashboard was added exactly the same as in that draft EIS chapter. USDOT released guidance on the use of a combined final EIS rod and errata sheets, so changes to incorporate this guidance were made to this chapter. The interim policy on page limits information was also added, stating that the text of the final EIS should be generally no more than 150 pages and no more than 300 if complex. And again, this does not include that executive summary, the appendices, or those materials incorporated by reference. Before the page limit is exceeded, the district again needs to coordinate and get authorization from OEM. And when it is one of those final EIS rods, the rod itself is not counted in those page limits. The one federal decision projects, of course, then again may require more pages, and the executive summary should be no more than 15. The standard statement that is used for notification was updated. And like the other chapters, the document review process was updated and a link was added to that online diagram. And like the draft EIS chapter, the guidance on submitting to EPA by OEM using ENEPA was updated. The limitations of claims notice information was also updated as it was for the FONSI chapter, with OEM providing the notice and cover letter to Federal Highway for their signature and then submitting them to the Federal Register. And the sample cover letter was removed as well. There were wording changes to the record of decision standard statement, and it was moved from the record of decision itself to the record of decision cover page. And that's for projects where the record of decision is done separately from the final EIS. But it was also added to those final EIS rod cover pages so that it's right there on the cover page. Chapter 10, state, local, or privately funded project delivery, had only a few minor changes, and they mainly pertained to the reevaluation of SEERs. Section 7 of the SEER reevaluation form was renamed District Approval, and the signature changed to the District Environmental Manager or Designee. Now, this form will be updated and swept when the manual is published. A new question was added here to the non-major state action checklist to identify those state conservation lands that are subject to ARC review and approval. And lastly, the issue resource titles were updated in both the SEER and the PEER form. Only minor changes were made to Chapter 11, Public Involvement. And in Chapter 12, Environmental Permits, a reference was added to the new FDOT Permit Handbook. The Osprey is no longer listed in Florida, so this information was removed from the chapter. The U.S. Coast Guard permit information was replaced with a reference to the new chapter that's on the U.S. Coast Guard projects and navigation. And additional clarifying language was provided throughout the chapter on mitigation opportunities and project schedules. Chapter 13, Reevaluations, was also updated. new guidance was released on reevaluations, and the text was modified to include the terminology. The changes mainly just provide clarification. There wasn't any big change in procedure. Redundant information on when a reevaluation is needed was removed for clarity, and changes were made to the FDOT document review process, similar to those made in other Part 1 chapters. And changes to the reevaluation form included adding the nationwide rivers inventory rivers, as well as updating some issue titles. For Chapter 14, Transit Project Delivery, the only change was to remove a sentence on project-level air quality documentation. There were only minor changes to Chapter 15, Project File and Records Management. And a new chapter was added as Chapter 16, United States Coast Guard Projects and Navigation. Now, this new chapter provides guidance on the environmental review process for projects that require a U.S. Coast Guard permit. It starts with a section on legislation authority that provides the background on those laws and regulations to protect safe navigation of waterways, and also the requirements of the U.S. Coast Guard. It then provides guidance on when a U.S. Coast Guard bridge permit may be needed. And it outlines some exceptions and exemptions for a bridge permit. It details 3 exemptions, including those that are included in the Coast Guard Authorization Act, the Advanced Approval Waterways, and Title 23 U.S.C. Part 144C. This last one only being applicable to those federal highway funded or eligible projects. A section is included that provides a background on the efforts to combine the federal agency review of the projects for streamlining purposes. There's an MOU between the U.S. Coast Guard and Federal Highway, clarifying that Federal Highway will normally be the lead agency when there's a highway section that requires an action by both agencies. And there's also a newer MOA between the U.S. Coast Guard and Federal Highway to expedite planning, environmental review, and decision making. It emphasizes early determinations, preparation of a coordinated environmental document that's going to satisfy both agency requirements, and concurrently conducting environmental evaluation and processing of that bridge permit application. There's also a process overview, and this process is different depending on which agency is going to be the lead agency. And for the purposes of this chapter, that lead agency is the one that is going to approve the environmental document. There are 3 different lead agency scenarios. The first is when FDOT is the lead agency for federal highway funded or eligible projects. So FDOT would be the lead due to NEPA assignment. In the second scenario, the U.S. Coast Guard is the lead agency for a state-funded project. Now, for the project, it would be determined through coordination with the U.S. Coast Guard early on. And in that instance, FDOT would prepare an EA or an EIS following the U.S. Coast Guard's procedure. The third scenario is FDOT as the lead agency for a state-funded project. So mainly the preparation of a SEER that could then be used by the U.S. Coast Guard as their NEPA document that is required for their permit. So for each of these different scenarios, there's guidance in the chapter on coordination during the ETDM process, the analysis and documentation that takes place during the PD&E phase, and actions during design and permitting. The coordination process also is going to differentiate between the U.S. Coast Guard districts, because all DOT districts except for District 3 lie within the U.S. Coast Guard District 7, while District 3 is within District 8. Figures at the end of the chapter include flowcharts similar to this one for each of those lead agency processes. There's also a sample bridge project questionnaire and a U.S. Coast Guard letter on bridge repair information, which is only applicable to those projects in District 3. And there's also a sample letter for preliminary determination of navigational clearance. Okay, well, that wraps up part 1, and it's time for our second poll question. As we move into part 2 of the manual, which is based on topics and analysis, please let us know what is your area of expertise. And you can select more than one here. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, great. It looks like we have more engineers in the audience. Thank you. Okay, let's delve into part 2 of the PD&E manual. Chapter 1, project description and purpose and need. In the logical termini section, categorical exclusions were added to the types of projects in which alternatives must connect logical termini, have independent utility, and not restrict consideration of alternatives for other reasonably foreseeable transportation improvements. And this change was due to changes in 23 CFR 771. Chapter 2, traffic analysis, only required minor changes. Chapter 3, engineering analysis, had quite a few changes. And these include changes to guidance on coordination with the aviation office for those projects that are in the vicinity of a public use or military airport, and also for complying with FAA regulations. There was clarification of TSM&O information, the addition of a reference to Federal Highways Bicycle and Pedestrian Planning Program and Project Development Guidance, clarification of the managed lanes process to be more in line with the new policy and updating the terminology. The roundabout section was removed, and the interchange access request process itself was clarified. For Chapter 4, sociocultural effects evaluation, edits were made to the standard statements for when a relocatee is involved and when there are no relocations. And this is just a minor text change. Chapter 5, aesthetic effects had only minor changes. And in Chapter 6, farmland, edits were only to the standard statement to document projects that are excluded from coordination with the Natural Resources Conservation Service when they're located in urbanized areas. And again, this was just a minor text change. Chapter 7, Section 4F resources. Most of these changes were minor edits and corrections. The Section 4F forms were removed as figures. So the forms are now created in this new Section 4F tool that's in the Statewide Environmental Project Tracker, or SWEPT. Also, guidance on documentation of no-use determinations was added, And information was also added on archaeological sites and related exemptions, including exclusion from late designation exemption in 23 CFR 774.11F, and exemption from Section 4F when primarily important for research value. Other changes included the clarification for constructive use determinations, including coordination with OEM, and clarification on Section 4F use arising from proximity impacts. Also, additional guidance for emergency repairs, and additional direction on consideration of changes to proximity impacts, such as noise and vibrations during reevaluation. Chapter 8, Archaeological and Historic Resources. Changes clarified that the districts coordinate with OEM on projects where adverse effects to historic or archaeological properties have been identified prior to initiating coordination with the SHPO or THPO. Revisions were made to clarify the requirement for discussing cultural resources at public hearings. In general, the public involvement activities must be influenced by the scale and the nature of the undertaking and the historic properties involved. It was clarified that for Type 2 CEs, the SHPO and THPO concurrence letters must be attached, and updated standard statements for no involvement with cultural resources, no historic properties affected, and no adverse effect or adverse effect to National Register of Historic Places properties. And a simple change from should to must was made to emphasize that 6 months is a hard deadline for completing the Section 106 consultation after emergency repair action. There were only minor changes to Chapter 9, Wetlands and Other Surface Water. And Chapter 10, Aquatic Preserves and Outstanding Florida Waters, was removed from the manual. Chapter 11, Water Resources. This chapter incorporated the information from the old Chapter 10. So that information didn't go away, it was just moved to this chapter. And this chapter was renamed and reorganized, and it also incorporated changes to the drainage manual. Now, minor edits were also made to the water quality impact evaluation form. Moving on, let's get into the recent round of changes to Part 2, Chapter 12, Wild and Scenic Rivers. This chapter was updated to clarify major changes made in the last revision. There's also a new section titled Florida Wild and Scenic Designation. There's one state designated wild and scenic river. It's the Myakka River, which was designated as a Florida Wild and Scenic River by the Myakka River Wild and Scenic Designation and Preservation Act, which is within the Florida statutes. And this river is located in FDOT District 1. So due to the addition of this section, there was clarification added that the rest of the chapter pertains only to those federally designated wild and scenic rivers. The procedure has been reorganized into new sections, separating out the nationwide rivers, inventory rivers, into their own section. And guidance was added on how to determine involvement with federally designated wild and scenic rivers, steady rivers, and those on the nationwide rivers inventory, or NRI. And there were clear definitions added on what is meant by involvement for each of these categories. And additional guidance was provided on the analysis for NRI rivers. For projects involving designated wild and scenic or steady rivers without impacts, new guidance has been added for Type 1 CE projects. And there's also new guidance on completing the Type 2 CE determination form. For nationwide rivers, inventory rivers, clarification was added that coordination with the National Park Service is only required if the project could have an adverse effect on the natural, cultural, or recreational values of the NRI. Information was also added on documentation in Type 1 CEs, as well as streamlined documentation for the other class of actions. And the Type 1 CE checklist, it now includes a separate question for projects that are on the NRI. Also, the Myakka River was added as a selection. And the Type 2 CE determination form was also edited to include a Florida Wild and Scenic River option as well, and the standard statement was modified. Only minor edits were made to Chapter 13, Floodplains, Chapter 14, Coastal Zone Consistency, and Chapter 15, Coastal Barrier Resources. Chapter 16, Protected Species and Habitat. Revisions to this chapter were based on last year's federal highway audit, recent correspondence with regulatory agencies, incorporation of the Federal Highway Memorandum, Management of the Endangered Species Act, Environmental Analysis and Consultation Process, and changes to Section 7, Interagency Cooperation of Federal Actions in 50 CFR Part 402. It also included clarification that the U.S. Coast Guard requires Section 7 consultation when a bridge permit is needed, and it included some reorganization of the chapter. Clarification was added on the use of species keys, and due to changes in Section 7, there's now a time frame for informal consultation. Effect determinations were clarified, as well as requirements for when consultation can be completed during the PD&E phase. Guidance on procedures during the design phase was edited, and the content of the Natural Resource Evaluation, or NRE, it was updated to match the changes in Section 7, and also updates to OEM's NRE guidance document. Now, this document will be released at the same time that this manual is published. And guidance on information to include in the reevaluation was also added. Changes were also made to the Type 1 CE documentation. The chapter was updated to clarify the process based on the lead agency agreement between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the U.S. Coast Guard. And finally, the federally listed species process flowchart was edited to incorporate changes made to the chapter. And now for Chapter 17, Essential Fish Habitat. Most of the changes to this chapter are based on the removal of the design and permitting section. Now, information from this section was moved to other areas of the chapter. Guidance was added on instances when consultation can't be completed during the PD&E phase. And in these situations, the district should coordinate with OEM to help determine the appropriate course of action to advance the project. And also a statement to use in the environmental document in this situation was added. For Type 1 CEs and non-major state actions, it was added that agency consultation letters are included in the project file, while concurrence letters are attached to the checklist. And text was removed from the statement that is included in Type 2 CEs, EAs, EISs, and SEERs. Chapter 18, Highway Traffic Noise. This version consists of only minor changes that have been approved by Federal Highway. And there was this adjustment of review date for cost factor elements that was updated. And changes to incorporate district comments that were made earlier in the year will be made in the upcoming 2021 version of the chapter. Chapter 19, Air Quality. Now, this chapter was completely rewritten and reorganized. Since Florida is in attainment for carbon monoxide and particulate matter National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The process for non-attainment areas was removed from the chapter. This information was instead transferred to a white paper to ensure that we have this information available just in case that Florida ends up being in non-attainment in the future. And so related to this, the detailed information on the state implementation plans and the transportation conformity was also removed. The reorganization focused the chapter on the project level analysis and provided more guidance on the MSAT qualitative analysis and clarified how to conduct air quality analysis. The detailed information in the NACs that were not pertinent to FDOT projects were removed, and the content was focused more on carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and those mobile source air toxics. And these were all combined into one air quality section. Clarification was also made that the project level analysis is not required for carbon monoxide, yet it may be needed in certain circumstances, which were added to the chapter. Also, edits were made to further clarify the CO Florida 2012 screening test. It was clarified that the project level analysis is not required for particulate matter, yet temporary construction impacts are minimized by adhering to regulations and the FDOT standard specifications. Non-attainment documentation in the Air Quality Technical Memorandum and the environmental document was removed, and the documentation was split into two different sections. Two flowchart figures were added on the process for carbon monoxide and MSAT analysis. And the sample traffic data for air quality analysis form, it was removed as a figure from the chapter, but it's still a form. And it was edited slightly, and the update will be available soon on FDOT's forms management system. Chapter 20, contamination, had only minor changes. And Chapter 21, utilities and railroads. In the railroads procedure section, text was added to provide guidance for rail safety projects, which are Type 1 CEs. The Type 1 CE checklist is used for these projects, and the district rail coordinator must coordinate with the district environmental office. Now for Chapter 22, commitments. Information on local agency program or LAP projects was moved up to the overview, and guidance on LAP project commitments was modified, explaining that FDOT should review the commitments to ensure that they're incorporated into the contract documents. Now for our last chapter, the new Chapter 23, Acquisition and Restoration Council Coordination. This new chapter provides guidance for projects that require the use of state-owned upland conservation lands that are managed for conservation, outdoor resource-based recreation, or archaeological or historic preservation. Now, these are lands that are held by the Board of Trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, also referred to as the Board of Trustees. The chapter then discusses land acquisition funds, special programs, and statutory authority. It also describes the policies established by the Board of Trustees, and it explains how to identify the applicability of state-owned lands, and explains the coordination between the FDOT and the Land Management Agency, and also between DOT, the Land Management Agency, and the Bureau of Public Lands Administration, and also the district's coordination with the OEM director. And this does include coordination for mitigation. The chapter also lays out the preparation of the ARC agenda item package, which is going to include an upland easement application, which at times may need supplemental information and sometimes may need a state lands impact report. The chapter discusses the process of scheduling the ARC meeting agenda item the ARC's review of the package, and also their determination and development of an MOA. And it then describes the signing of the MOA and the FDEP preparation of easement documents for FDOT approval. And then it covers how you document all of this in the environmental document. It includes a section on other applicable laws and regulations that may apply when a project affects state-owned conservation lands, such as Section 4F, Section 6F of the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And a figure was added at the end of the chapter to outline this process. Well, that wraps up the changes to the PD&E manual, but before we move on to the ETDM manual, let's go over PD&E training materials that are available on OEM's website. Now, most of the Part 1 chapters, they have a corresponding CBT trainings and learning curve, and these are easily accessible from the PD&E manual website. And notice here next to several of these chapters, you'll see a CBT in parentheses, and that is a link to the corresponding training and learning curve. Also, links to these trainings are available on the PD&E training webpage under the PD&E training track 3. Okay, let's move on to the changes in the Efficient Transportation Decision-Making Manual. Most of the edits to this manual were pen and ink changes, including editorial corrections, changes to incorporate those updates that we just talked about that were made to the 2020 PD&E manual, and some synonymous word replacements. Now for some specifics, edits were made to chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these chapters incorporated edits made in the 2020 PD&E manual, such as updating the references to those manual chapters that had changed, reordering and renaming of the preliminary environmental discussion and ETAT review topics, and the use of consistent capitalization for cooperating and participating agencies. And another change included replacing the word dispute in dispute resolution to issue, and this was at the request of the Office of General Counsel. So in order to reduce confusion with this new wording may have caused, we also changed the word issue throughout the manual when it was previously used in a different context. So for example, changing the issue to topic when referencing the environmental topics. And note that this is simply a text change and it does not change the process, the intent, or the expectations of the procedure at all. These changes will also be reflected in the EFT when the updates to the manual are published. The revision date and the history log were also updated in these chapters. There was a minor correction made to the acronym document, and no changes were made to chapters 1 and 6 of the manual. Here are the changes that were made to topic names and the new PED order. Some of the topics were named to match those in the PD&E manual, and the PED items were reordered to kind of line up better with how they're laid out in the environmental document during PD&E. Now, changes to the ETDM manual were discussed with the districts at quarterly ETDM coordinators meetings as edits were identified. Anticipated pen and ink changes to the manual were first discussed at a meeting in October of 2019, and this included incorporating PD&E manual updates and editorial corrections. In January of 2020, the list of edits expanded and included the incorporation of the PD&E manual updates, more editorial corrections, and the changing of dispute to issue resolution was discussed. And in April, the pen and ink changes that were incorporated in the manual were discussed during the ETDM coordinators meeting. Now, the 2020 versions of both the PD&E manual and the ETDM manual will be published on July 1st on OEM's website. Now, before we move on to our question and answer session, we'd like to do one last poll. How well does the information shared in this webinar help you with your job? And please note, the best is at the top and the worst is at the bottom. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Okay, great. Oh, good. I'm glad this was helpful. Thank you for your feedback. And now we're going to welcome your questions. Please enter them into the chat. There are subject matter experts that we have on the line to help answer them. Are there any questions currently in the chat?
Yeah, sure. We have quite a few, and we have answered some through the chat, but I think a lot of that information can be shared with the audience. The first question: will a copy of the current PD&E manual be archived for reference? Christine, can you go ahead and answer that question?
Yes, the PD&E webpage will have a link to the manual, the current manual now. It also has a link to the previous versions as well. I believe there will be 3 historic versions available on the website.
Thank you. Here's another question. Are the slides accessible somewhere? I would like to share with my team. Yes, the slides and the recording of this session will be posted on OEM's website. It does take a little bit of time for GoTo to do the conversion, but we anticipate posting of this later this week or next week. Here is a question about the FDOT permitting handbook. The permitting handbook is also posted on OEM's website. So please take a look at the OEM website and you should be able to find the permitting handbook posted there. Here is a question for Roy regarding 4F. Why would NHPA Criterion D exempt an archaeological site from 4F?
That's a good question. It doesn't technically release it from protection under 4F on its own, because a site can be important for the information it contains, as well as other information or other reasons like association with a cultural period or something along those lines. It's the way the regulations are written and the way the courts have interpreted it are that if the site is primarily important for its research value, that is, the information that can be obtained via recovery, via an archaeological excavation, then it would be contrary to the intent of Section 4F to prohibit the recovery of those artifacts. And oddly enough, the judge went on to say that it doesn't matter whether or not a decision is made to recover them. And that may be because of tribal input, that sometimes tribes don't want them recovered. But that's what it is. That is what that principle is based on. It originally arose because there was an exemption in Section 106 to archaeological investigations, an exemption to our normal criteria of adverse effect, which has since been removed, but the Section 4F regulations still retain that reasoning, and it hasn't been challenged since then. I hope that answer was clear. What it comes down to is if it's important for more than the information it contains, then it contains, then Section 4F would apply to it. What the other portion of the exception for archaeological sites is that the late designation exemption doesn't apply to them. That even if they're discovered during construction, we have to determine whether or not they are important for more than the information they contain. And if they are important for more than the information they contain, then we have to apply 4F to them, even if they're discovered during construction. Granted, it would include the consideration of where we are in construction, how much money's been spent, and how committed we are to the corridor that we are on. So the odds are it wouldn't make a material difference to the final decision.
Thanks, Roy.
I hope that helped. That was a lot, but I hope it helped.
All right, let's go to another question. Does the 75-page limit on NEPA documents include cultural resource assessment surveys? And I
Those
think,
would be,
yeah, go ahead, Christine.
yeah, I believe that that would be included as a referenced document rather than being a part of the document itself. So I don't think it would be included in that page limit.
All right, thank you. Does the public involvement chapter include updates for virtual meetings from COVID? And Katasha, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. Our manual does not address that. There's additional guidance that's coming out from FDOT for that situation, since hopefully it's temporary, even though it's a long temporary time. But we do have other guidance that is not included in the manual.
Thank you. Here's a question about Type 1 checklist form. Are there any changes for the Type 1 checklist form?
Yes, there are actually quite a few changes depending on the issue, and those are going to be published, are going to be actually updated and swept at the same time that the manual is updated.
Perfect, thank you. Is there clarification for the difference between commitments and implementation measures? It seems like this has been a source of constant confusion and updating. I'll go ahead and answer this one. Commitments versus implementation measures is included in the recent NRE guidance document that will be posted on OEM's website, along with the updated PD&E Manual and ETDM chapters. More information about implementation measures and commitments can also be found in the recent NRE webinar that is also posted on OEM's website. Specifically, commitments, more information on what commitments can be made or should be made can also be found in Part 2, Chapter 22 of the PD&E Manual. Here is a question regarding the utility chapter. Are there any updates to the utility chapter?
I can take that too.
Okay.
There were just minor changes to the utilities part of the chapter. However, there were some changes on the railroad part of the chapters that Christine mentioned, and regarding the guidance for rail safety projects, which are Type 1 CEs, and where the Type 1 CE checklist needs to be used for these projects. And we encourage that there's coordination by the district rail coordination and the district environmental office.
Thanks, Maria. Let me see if there are any other questions. There is one question about FDOT staff hour estimates. Will FDOT staff hour estimates be revisited, revised to reflect the changes made in the PD&E manual, namely air quality? Maria, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, we will look at the staff hour estimates and see if what changes will need to be made.
All right, thank you. At this time, Christine, I don't see any other questions that we haven't responded to. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box and we can address it at this time. Okay.
In the meantime, I can throw in this reminder that today's webinar is going to be made available on the OEM PD&E Manual website.
We have one more question that popped in about the one federal decision. Do you anticipate having more verbal discussions, meetings, and outlining concurrence points on projects? And I can open that up to anyone on the team to answer that one.
I believe that OEM does not anticipate that many of their projects will be these one federal decision projects. So I believe probably coordination will take place if one arises.
All right, thank you. The question about NRE guidance document, will there be another session to go over the NRE guidance document? There has not been, another session has not been scheduled, but the NRE guidance webinar has been posted on OEM's website. So please take a look at that. And if you have any questions, please contact us. This is kind of a big question, but we'll go ahead and address this. Can you discuss in more detail the changes regarding the U.S. Coast Guard permitting guidance? Christine, do you want to take that one?
The new chapter?
I think that's what they're referring to.
Okay. Do you want me to go back to, should I go back to those slides, you think?
Yeah, if you could.
Okay. Back up here. I wonder if there's specifics. Can you give me the question again so I can get my bearing here?
Can you discuss in more detail the changes regarding the U.S. Coast Guard permitting guidance?
Oh, the changes to the Coast Guard permitting guidance itself. That's such a broad question. I'm not quite sure how to answer that one.
I know, other than we created a new chapter to kind of pull out Coast Guard specifically, and we provided guidance specifically for the Miami District office and for those districts, or for District 3 that work with the New Orleans office. So please take a look at the chapter for that. It just has a lot of information about how to coordinate with either one of those districts if your project is in the appropriate region for that. So a lot of information on that chapter.
Yeah, when the chapter comes out, a good place to look too is at the flow chart. There's a flow chart like this for each one of the processes, which kind of gives you like an overview of what those are. That might be a good place to start.
I think this is just a comment. The standard scope of services for design and PD&E may also be updated, and we'll take a look at that, I'm sure, once the PD&E manual has been published, to see if we need to make any changes. So far, I think we have all of the questions responded to at this time. Oh, here goes a little bit more. Nope, I think that's it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon.